very warm welcome, Your Excellencies, ladies, gentlemen, friends, partners, colleagues, everyone. Welcome to the British Library, where I have the great pleasure of being Chief Executive, and welcome to a little bit of London that is forever Jaipur.
There is a sense of intense homecoming as we return, even though virtually, to JLF in London. It's been a huge privilege to partner with the British Library, and this collaboration has been so full of joy and learning.
It's a particular pleasure for me to come back to the British Library, which has been my office in London for many years, and where my books have all been written and researched, and it's very nice to see this end of my life sort of double back on it.
Our amazing writers, today more than any time, because of the way the digital age has taken over, we need you to be able to make sense of the past, divine the future, and perhaps set in context what we're going through at this very point of time.
This is the first time I've been to it in London. I've been to the one in Rajasthan before, and it's fantastic. It's got a different vibe here, but it's equally wonderful here.
JLF brings this amazing festival to London. It's a wonderful get-together of writers and thinkers, and you know, I only go to one festival, literature festival in the world, and it's this one.
The people who've been here, both bookshop customers, the authors and the organisers, have been an absolute delight to work with. I can honestly say as well that this is the best dressed, most elegantly dressed crowd at any literary festival I've ever seen anywhere.
It's maintained the standards which I'm accustomed to in Jaipur itself, and I'm extremely happy to be part of it here.
I love this festival. I think it's a privilege for me.
JLF deserves enormous congratulation for the way that it puts its program together here. I think that all of the events are superbly chaired. I think that the setting here in the British Library is just a fantastic environment.
Teamwork Arts and British Library welcome you back to JLF London 2020, presented in partnership with the Aga Khan Foundation UK and our patrons, the Murthy Family Foundation. Our magazine partner for this series is The Week, Journalism with a Human Touch. We'd love for you to consider donating to help us with JLF London at the British Library by clicking on the donation link below. Our next session is Vanni, a family struggle through the Sri Lankan conflict. Benjamin Dix and Lindsay Pollock in conversation with George Alagaya. Benjamin Dix's Vanni, illustrated by Lindsay Pollock, is a graphic novel that documents the human aspects of the Sri Lankan Civil War. The book experiments with genres to explore complex social and human rights issues and the associated narratives of modern warfare, forced migration, and asylum. Dix and Pollock speak to George Alagaya about the genre of sequential art and the intensely human and heartbreakingly tragic stories they have tried to convey through it. Benjamin Dix is a senior fellow at SOAS University of London. He was based in Tamil Tiger-controlled Vanni in northern Sri Lanka with the United Nations from 2004 to 2008 throughout the conflict and was one of the last people to leave Kilinochchi. Vanni, a family struggle through the Sri Lankan conflict, is his debut graphic novel, adapting testimonies from survivors of the Sri Lankan conflict into sequential art. Lindsay Pollock is an illustrator. His graphic novel Vanni, co-produced with Ben Dix of Positive Negatives, told the story of the Sri Lankan Civil War based on original interviews and first-person testimonies. George Alagaya is presenter of BBC News at 6, Britain's most watched news programme. That role followed 10 years as a foreign correspondent covering the 9/11 attacks on New York, the genocide in Rwanda, civil wars in Liberia, Afghanistan, and Sierra Leone, and Nelson Mandela's presidency. The Burning Land was shortlisted for the Authors Club Best First Novel Award and the Paul Torday Memorial Prize. Our sessions are available to view on london.jlflitfest.org and on our Facebook page, JLF Litfest, and on our YouTube channel, Jaipur Litfest, JLF. Please do remember to comment and ask questions by typing it into the comment section below, and we will get George to ask our speakers of the same. Ladies and gentlemen, Vanni, a family struggle through the Sri Lankan conflict, Benjamin Dix and Lindsay Pollock in conversation with George Alagaya. George, over to you.
Sanjoy, thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction. And I just want to say a little bit more about myself, which may sound rather big-headed, but you'll see why. I mean, my journey, yes, I did all those things at the BBC, but my journey starts in Sri Lanka. I was born there, and my family left in the 60s, first generation of the Tamil diaspora. So I feel particularly close to this session, and can't wait to start discussing it, because the truth is that as a BBC journalist, there's a part of me that feels there was unfinished business, that perhaps I could have done more as a BBC journalist on reporting the country of my birth. One other thing I think is just worth saying, because I think it is pertinent for this book, Vanni, is that for most people out there, and we're talking to you from a bright and sunny London, for most people out there here in Britain, Sri Lanka is a tourist destination now. And I think very early on in Vanni, there's a character that sort of talks to about Sri Lanka and says, talks about the crystal clear ocean, the cocktails and so on. So it's a paradise. And what Vanni does in I think the most powerful way is to just get behind that screen. It's not saying either or, it's got to be paradise or it's got to be what happened in the Civil War, but the two things are knitted together. And I hope that will become obvious as we talk to Benjamin and Lindsay over the next sort of 35 minutes or so. And as Sanjoy said, there'll be 10 minutes or so at the end for questions. So Ben, let me start with you. I just wonder, I mean, this is described as a graphic novel, a comic, and I think Sanjoy was talking about sequential art. I mean, all sorts of ways of describing it. Just tell me, do you think this was a way in which you could say something that conventional media was not saying or has not said?
Yes, when I left Vanni, I came back to the UK emotionally, personally and professionally destroyed at what I had witnessed, and I was increasingly frustrated with the lack of engagement through media, through politics on what was happening in Sri Lanka. A couple of years later, we see Arab Spring and the unfolding of Egypt and Syria, and the media are all over it, politics are all over it. But in Vanni, there was no mass refugee crisis. There was no oil off the coast of Jaffna. There was no strategic geopolitical influence in Sri Lanka. And therefore, it was a bit of a non-story. But what I had witnessed was, close to 140,000 people dying in the space of 9 months. And that's an incredible number. And so I came out of there frustrated and wanted to tell the story in a non-conventional way, not through a media, not through academia, but through try something different. And that started the idea of doing a graphic novel. And you could have chosen, and I know you've been involved in this before in film and photography. Just what is it about the sequential art, about an illustrated novel, if I can put it that graphic novel, that you think is so much more powerful than the alternatives that were there in front of you? Well, I think for a start, there's anonymisation issues. So what we're telling in the Vanni is an incredibly sensitive story. The characters, the protagonists, the families that are being told through that story. When we started in 2012, when Lindsay and I started working on the book, the people that we're telling their stories were an incredibly sensitive situation. They were either applying for asylum in London, in Zurich. They were refugees in Chennai, in South India. So telling their story in front of a camera could have consequences on their asylum applications. It could also have consequences on their family and loved ones left at home on the island. From the state, from persecution, etc. So by telling it as a graphic novel, we have told a work of non-fiction fiction, as I think we like to call it, that these are true stories, but the characters are hidden behind Lindsay's illustrations, and no one can go after an illustration. They don't really exist. So, but their stories exist, and so that was a very sensitive way of allowing people to tell our story, to tell their stories, for Lindsay and I to hold those stories and present them to the world with the real anonymized security that our respondents could say.
And Lindsay, if I could bring you in now, it's clear from what Benjamin has already said, but also what Sanjoy said. Ben spent an enormous amount of time in Sri Lanka, got to know its people in the hardest, most desolate of times very well. So there was, one imagines, an emotional connection. Now that wasn't the same for you, Lindsay. So how did you go about? I mean, I simply can't see how you could have drawn but created these amazing illustrations without having some kind of emotional connection, and yet it wasn't a sort of first-hand connection. So how did you go about that?
Well, I think, as you touched on there, George, I sort of the war was one that I think was largely overlooked and in the international media. And for me, I didn't know all that much about it myself, you know, the little that I'd gleaned from the fairly limited reporting on the news. And so meeting Ben and hearing his experiences, first of all, sort of sparked my interest. But then it was really a process of, in a very concerted way. We went out and did the research in terms of, and I did a tremendous amount of reading around the thing and sort of looking through the news and sort of teaching myself. But we went and we met as many people as we possibly could who had experienced it firsthand. And in that context, we were really privileged that we were able to, we had the help of personal friends and former colleagues of Ben who were able to help us out. But also we worked with Freedom from Torture, and we were incredibly lucky to be able to be put in touch with some users of, or some clients of that charity who had experienced the worst possible abuses. And it very, very quickly sort of crystallized for me as I sort of sat down and sort of heard people talking about things that had happened directly to them, and sort of saw the pain and the stoicism with these people directly in front of me. The sort of the responsibility that I had to sort of get it right really sort of crystallized, and it really. It really spurred me on to sort of do everything that I could.
So, sorry to interrupt, because one of the things, and I do hope people in their tens of thousands are going to go out and get this graphic novel, because one of the things that comes across, I mean, as Sanjoy said, you know, I've seen my fair share of violence, the blood and gore, if you like, of war. What's much harder to convey, and I know this as a television journalist and as a print journalist, but you have managed, is the mental anguish, the trauma that comes with uncertainty, and you have shown it in the faces of these two, the family Ramachandrans and the Cholagars, who you both focus on. But you can see that now. I know you had the benefit of Ben's library archive of photos and documents. How much did that help you get inside these people's heads? And perhaps you can see some of those pictures actually now, the juxtaposition between your drawings and what Ben gave you.
Oh, sure. If we can see those, that'd be great. And they were completely invaluable. You know, we went through Ben's incredible archive of photographs, but also the great archive of photographs and first-hand camera phone footage that had been gradually collated after the war. You know, this was just before smartphones and sort of the kind of and cameras were really common. And I think that it would have been a very different situation if the technology had been a couple of years further on. But people did have the earliest generations of sort of camera phones and digital cameras. And after the war, an extraordinary and really horrifying archive of images started to be collated, particularly on the website TamilNet. And that kind of, you know, it was a really sort of traumatizing kind of experience for me in you know, sort of, albeit in this kind of very detached kind of way, but sort of going through these photos and images in order to try to glean something of the emotional reality, as well as just the physical and visceral reality of what it's like being trapped in a war zone. You know, that was something which was really crucial to putting together these images.
And if it is possible to see those pictures now, that would be great. But Ben, can I ask you? You know, this is a story that's told over, well, actually many years, because it starts with the tsunami, and perhaps we'll come back to that later. But certainly over very many months and towards the end of the Civil War. And yet you kind of focused it very much on two families, or really one family and their neighbours, the Ramachandrans, as I said, and the Tolagas. How did you both decide that was the way in which you were going to tell this very big story?
Well, yeah, we went. So, as you say, the story was huge, and you know, back in 2012, Lindsay and I had no experience of storytelling in this side. So there's, as you know, there's probably the book's 280 pages, and there's probably 3 times that on the editing floor. And we had to keep condensing these stories. And what we tried to do was to, again, coming back to anonymizing, we got these 20 Tamil survivors of the conflict, London, Zurich, who are in London, Zurich and Chennai, and amalgamated their stories into these 2 families. And it was important to tell it through 2 families because one family would have never experienced all of these experiences. That was too much. But by separating it into 2 families, there could be a narrative arc that Lindsay and I could play with to be able to show the enormity of people's experiences without over dramatizing it and putting it all on the shoulders of one character, which would have just been kind of unbelievable. And so we kind of played with that, and then multiple characters who are kind of in the periphery of the story throughout.
So I mentioned the tsunami, which was one of the few occasions I did go out to Sri Lanka as a reporter. Now, essentially, this is the story. I mean, as it says here, you know, it's a family struggle through the Sri Lankan conflict. So you could have started this graphic novel in 2009, you know, which is the tail end, at the very end of the Civil War. And yet, Lindsay, you start actually. We see the Ramachandrans and then their village being caught up in the tsunami. Why did you feel the need to start there and not later in the Civil War proper, if I can put it that way?
Well, I think for me, there's sort of if there was a sort of you know, we intended as sort of an educative purpose with the book, that's for sure. But if there was a kind of a political project to it as well, I think for me personally, it was to do with encouraging empathy with people who are going through the asylum process, encouraging empathy with people who've experienced conflict and war. And as we did the research, the enormity of the experience of the people that we were talking to really struck me. You know, and it was the fact that the war had come off the back of this dreadful natural disaster, I thought was so striking. And I thought that there was such kind of metaphoric power to begin a book which ends up with a character who in the asylum system is washed up on the shores of a foreign land, to begin it with this wave which in reality had crashed over these self-same people just 10 years before, created a sort of a framing device that I thought was really powerful. But you know, you could have actually started the book years and years and years before that, because you know, I mean, the reality of the conflict and everything which had led up to it, or you know, in fact this had been bubbling along for decades, and you could go back to the time of the British on the island there, you know, and beyond, you know. So you pick a place to start, but the wave seemed to me to have a real sort of metaphoric power.
And for me, I arrived in Sri Lanka in Vanni.
I was going to say, because your association with Sri Lanka started
with the
on
tsunami,
day 2 of the tsunami or something.
Yeah, exactly. So for me, you know, my photographs, my interviews, you know, my experiences all started 2 days after. So you know, and this is something that Lindsay and I, when we've been interviewed on events like this, that we're quite clear, you know, or my expertise of Sri Lanka is the 4 years that I was there, and then the 2 or 3 years afterwards. We're not scholars to go back and start writing books about colonial rule of Sri Lanka, nor are we about contemporary politics. So it was a real contained book from tsunami to asylum seeker of 2004 to 2014, which is our lived experience.
And just going back to that time of the tsunami, I certainly remember. I mean, there's lots of images, obviously, from that period that one can take away. The sheer force of nature, and not the least of it. But I suppose the one thing I remember all these years on, from 2004, is the resilience of the people in the face of the tsunami. And I wondered if let's go to Lindsay. I mean, were you conscious of that in when you're doing the character development for this book? Were you conscious of that, getting across that sense of resilience, that though they are in a literal sense victims, that they weren't in an emotional or mental sense victims?
Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of, you know, that was a sort of a characteristic of the people that we spoke to in preparing the book, was this sort of quality of really striking stoicism. And that was something which I think we wanted to represent, because it's sort of, you know, it's something that you really experience when you speak to a lot of these people. And it's not to say that, you know, that they don't carry tremendous damage and post-traumatic stress. You know, it's not to say that those things don't manifest, but they do have a stoicism which I think is born of at this point sort of generations of experience of disenfranchisement and conflict and uncertainty. And so that was a sort of an aspect which we also, you know, we're two white English men, and we were very conscious of that. You know, if had we been aware of any sort of Tamil people who were producing a comic about the thing at that time, we might well have sort of stood back and said, okay, well, good. But, you know, we were the ones who looked around and we were doing it. But I was very conscious of trying to get right the way in which we represented the nature of the community, and that aspect, I think, of stoicism, I thought was really important to put across. And the way that the characters react to the tsunami at the very beginning of the book, I think, establishes that and then carries through the narrative.
And Benjamin, I mean, just wanted to talk you. You've talked a little bit about this, but the process of writing it. I mean, you know, one imagines the kind of the Bernie Taupins and the Elton Johns and the Lennon and the McCartneys and so on. You know, who does the lyrics, who does the music. I mean, how did that work? And I mean, try to be as honest as you can. I mean, were there clashes ever? Did you always, you know, end up on the same page, as it were?
Yes, I think through. I mean, you know, there's artistic. Well, no, not creative clashes. There's, I mean, through the project took 7 years to produce this book, and I think the first, you know, year and a half was us really the first year was me emptying my head to Lindsay in his studio, going through thousands of photographs. You know,
so Lindsay, you were playing psychiatrist as well, or something, were you?
Yeah, it was a head burden, George.
Go ahead, Ben. Yeah, sorry.
And so we were going through all of that experience, and it was a cathartic exercise for me to tell someone. And Lindsay is an incredibly sensitive, patient, empathetic guy who could sit there and just absorb these stories that I was telling him, and they were gruesome, horrific stories. And at the time that I was telling him these stories, my friends and colleagues from the Vanni were still being persecuted, and were still, so it was a raw emotion that I was feeling, and I felt this huge injustice and this huge urge to tell the world this story. It was the most important story. I thought the world had to know about this because it was incredibly personal to me. But I wasn't skilled at that time. I am more skilled now, but at that time I had never written a book. I had never turned these stories into a narrative. And so I came to Lindsay, I think the way we like to describe it is I came to Lindsay with a story. And then Lindsay started to turn that story into sketches and into storyboards. And then as time went on, it became quite clear that page by page, it was Lindsay who started to write the actual script into the speech bubbles, because he got to know the experience almost as well as I did. And as he was drawing, it became more obvious to him that, that this is what the two characters should be talking to each other. And then I'm
just going to interrupt, Ben, just for a second. We are actually, our audience around the world is able to see now the photographs that you took and the illustrations that came from it. Sorry to interrupt. Keep going.
So what you're looking at right now is actually the first illustration. So I sent that photograph on the left to Lindsay. I had taken that as one of the first displacements within the Vanni as the Sri Lankan army started pushing up into the Vanni. And I sent that to Lindsay before I'd even met him on an email. I was then going down the stairs into Paddington tube station, and I checked my phone, and Lindsay sent me this illustration on the other side. And it was at that eureka moment I was like, we're going to do a graphic novel on this. Right. And then as time went on, so Lindsay would start writing the actual script into the speech bubbles, and I had this wealth of Tamil friends and communities around the world that chapter by chapter I would take to them to say, does this look like your story? Does this read like your story? Is this the kind of thing that a child would say to their father in this situation? And we went through this whole editing process, which took a huge amount of time. But what we're proud of at the end is that we have a piece of work that has been checked hundreds of times by different people who have lived this experience of this book.
Lindsay, so while we've got this photograph and our behind the scenes technical staff who are brilliant at this kind of thing, and the three of us aren't, but they may move this photo on, and I hope they do, because there are lots of other pictures. Let's look at this one actually, because so this was a very telling, famous moment, which is why don't you were there explain?
So this photograph I took, this was the UN were about to evacuate from Vanni in September 2008, and for a week we, as the UN, I was a UN worker, were barricaded into our compounds, and this was the Tamil community pleading with us day and night not to leave. They understood that we couldn't continue building shelters and handing out water and food. It was too dangerous. There were air attacks going off all the time, but they were pleading with us to stay and bear witness to the onslaught that was about to happen. And so I took a number of photographs like this of just people pleading, and it was the most horrific time for me. I'd been there for 4 years. I knew people in that crowd. I knew those hands of those people. And it was a real sense of that white privilege, that I was barricaded into the safety of a UN compound with bunkers, and they were on the outside, and then we drove out and abandoned them.
And Lindsay, I find this quite interesting, because I remember years ago telling a story in Rwanda of people having surgery, operations without anaesthetic, and we decided in the end the pictures were just too disturbing. So my cameraman focused on a child's hand or feet. I can't remember exactly. I think it was a feet while this operation was going on. It turned out told you more. It was more disturbing in a way just to see the disembodied thing. I mean, what was your reaction when you saw these hands poking through the gate, pleading in a very physical, tactile way?
Well, I mean, the sad thing is that in many ways this was the least of it. The sort of the original raw photographs that are easily available out there. If you do a Google image search for the Sri Lankan War, there's images of absolute carnage. And I think that it's really important to recognise the truth of what conflict means. The fact that there was no one there to protect the little children that were there, or to protect anybody from being subject to that carnage, but also witnessing it. And I think it's really important for people to get some kind of a degree of reality check about what we're talking about when we, drop bombs, sell bombs. I think that's really important. But at the same time, as you say, it's incredibly off-putting just to sort of show the goriest of details, and you can't really expect people to or expect everyone to be able to sort of engage with that. And also, you don't want to be a rubbernecker or a voyeur.
I just want to, well, we've got this picture of the UN compound, and we don't have anyone from the United Nations here now. So, Ben, you're going to have to be stand-in for, if you like, the aid community, the rich world that goes around dispensing aid. I mean, the truth is, whether it is in Sri Lanka in this instance, or Rwanda, the UN and white people, I don't want to make it, it's not a racist point, but you are white and you're in a country that isn't, obviously, you get out. When the going gets tough, you get out. I saw that in Rwanda. You've seen it. I mean, I wonder if, if there's a sense of guilt. I mean, did you feel that at all when you were there and having to leave?
It destroyed me. I mean, I've spent the last 10 years putting my life back together, and this book was part of that process to tell that story. I mean, I lived there for 4 years. And the Vanni is a rural, underdeveloped area of North Sri Lanka. You get to know everyone when you've been there for 4 years. And, I'm now an anthropologist. I spent my time running around every corner of the Vanni. I know the Vanni better than any place in the world. And you make friends, you go to christenings, you go to weddings, you go to funerals. You're part of that community. And suddenly it gets to 2008 and you're locked in a compound, people pleading outside, and then you're driven out of there. And I spent the last couple of days, I quit the UN. I was sick of it while I was there, and I ran around helping my friends dig makeshift bunkers in their courtyards, and putting oil drums in their courtyards, and basically I remember clearly putting a 2-year-old child in an oil drum and basically burying her in the ground the day before we left, and then drove out. And I came back, had huge PTSD, and part of working with Lindsay was that cathartic process of the survivor's guilt, but then also the process of understanding one's sense in the world, that you're the white guy and you get out, and your colleagues, who you were a team, they stay behind and perish. And it was horrific.
I'm going to stop you there, and thank you for being so honest. Thank you for being so open about that. It is actually, we're getting some questions coming in, actually, so we'll fold them in. I think we've got about another 10 minutes or so. So this is a question, I think, probably for you, Lindsay. Sakdev Ramakrishna asks, graphic tales like yours are novel and brilliant ways of portraying heart-rending themes. Why is this genre of narration not more common? And I guess, are there enough illustrators to do the job properly? But what do you think, Lindsay? What's your answer?
Yeah, I think they are really powerful, and I think that gradually more people are sort of coming around to realizing that comic books can be literature much as anything else. Yeah, I'm really happy if people sort of recognize the power of it. I think for me, the sort of the thing which is most powerful about a comic book is the fact that it operates on a sort of system of juxtapositions, and there's so much interest which can be brought out with that. And so when you flick through a comic book, it's as if you're sort of able to sort of flick through a sort of a period of time, and with the panels, you're able to juxtapose different moments, which have been particularly useful in this book for sort of rendering the experience of PTSD, the experience of memory, and the sort of, particularly the intrusion of unwanted memories was a motif that we used over and over. And you get that with the juxtaposition of images on a single page. So you have the sort of the text, you have what's said and the sort of the explicit story of the thing, but then you also have the ability to sort of get at these internal emotional experiences through the visual. And yeah, there is a lot to the comic form.
This is a question from Lindsay, and it's I assume it's not you, Lindsay, it's another Lindsay.
Great name.
Benjamin. How would you say your first-hand experience of the Sri Lankan conflict as a communications manager, I didn't know that actually, for the United Nations impacted your portrayal of survivors' testimonies? Now, you've talked a little bit about your role in the UN already, so let me just add a little bit something to Lindsay's question, which is that, you know, the UN is a bit like the BBC, you know, we're not allowed to have opinions, you know, and can't make judgments. So, I mean, you know, quite often UN spokespeople are criticized for the blandness of their observations of whichever conflict they're presiding over. And I wondered if you were aware of that when you were there as a communications manager, wanting to say something, but having, you know, the old UN plaster over your mouth. And how was it once you were able to speak freely, as you have done in Vanni?
I was a very bad UN communications manager. I didn't believe at all in the impartiality of it. There was a group of people being brutalised by a state government, and I wanted to tell the world. And I did not handle that role of being told that I couldn't speak out very well at all. So I was quite happy to leak pictures and stories to your colleague, Roland Burke, who was the BBC correspondent at the time, and I was quite happy to do that. And if they wanted to sack me, well, they couldn't get me out of the Vanni at the time because I was stuck in there. So I quit my job the day we evacuated, and I've never looked back. There are people that can do that job. I couldn't.
Okay, so now I know that for the benefit of our viewers, I'm going to mention a page number, and I know in some ways it's maybe too detailed for you at the moment as you're watching this, but it's page 141. I don't know which of you is responsible for this, but there's a line where the army is shelling what was supposed to be a no-fire zone, and in the bubble, it's one of the characters says, "Oh, they've overshot," as if somehow the army simply made a mistake, when everything we know about this and are told about this, and presumably Benjamin, Lindsay, you believe, was that there was intention there. So I'm just was that an oversight? Did you mean to that implication? Oh, they've overshot, which makes it sound the whole thing sound accidental.
No, I think that was more that they've overshot us. So they're in the middle of a battle, and they haven't. The shell didn't land on the Tiger fighters. It's overshot us, but it's gone into the no-fire zone. It's gone into the civilian.
To clear it up, as I understand it, the accusation is not simply that these were this was a question of bad targeting or mistaken targeting, but that actually the civilians were the targets.
Yeah, very much so, and that's brought out in other areas of the book where there's quite clear targeting of hospitals, of the no fire zone shelters, of the civilian camps. But that particular bit was more of an overshot from the perspective of that group of tigers that were fighting.
I think that's an aspect of the sort of the horror of the story as well, though, is that sort of the whole way through over this, over this years and years long story, you've got these characters who are sort of talking about, well, if we can just get through this, if we can just reach, the sort of following month, if we can just get to the next no fire zone, if we can get to the next safe zone, if we can last out the war, then it will end if we can avoid it. And it is the sort of the story which I think was true for the people who were there, of this sort of gradual, slow, horrifying, dawning realization that in fact there wasn't going to be any escape from it this time. In fact, they were going to be pushed and pushed and pushed into an ever smaller area, but that everybody was going to be made subject to the horror and the carnage this time. And so I think that's a really sort of a key aspect of the story that the book tells, of sort of realizing that actually there are no rules in this particular conflict.
Okay, let me just, I want to involve the audience as much as I can, as we can. And this is a question from Nilanjana, and it's really to Benjamin. So positive negatives approach, this is the organization you talked about earlier and the one you founded, Ben. Positive negatives approach places great emphasis on, quote, continual engagement and reaffirmation from participants. Why would you say this engagement is so vital to the process of creation?
Well, I guess that goes back to that day when I drove out with those hands coming through the fence. This isn't my story. I found myself back in the UK, and it's me that's brought onto the stage to talk about this. I'm not a Sri Lankan Tamil refugee from Sri Lanka, but again, there's Lindsay and I talking about the book. Okay, it's our book, but it's us that are talking about it. So Positive Negatives is now an organisation that tells stories like the Vanni. We've done about 60 animations and comics now from issues all over the world, but none of them are my story. None of them are my team's story. So it's what we are is a conduit between the story and the media. And so it's so important for us to continually go back to the people who are the custodians of their story to check whether we're telling it right, it looks right, this has the right nuance to it, again and again, so that every piece that we present is as much their story as possible.
Okay, I'm really sorry about this. I've got another whole page of thoughts that I wanted to talk to you both about, but I'm getting messages here privately saying our time is up. So let me just, as a final thing, say, I mean, for me, as a person who spent most of my conflict in war zones of one form or another, I mean, I think what this book, Vanni, that you, Lindsay, and Benjamin have managed to do is portray and celebrate what I would call the many, many small acts of heroism that go on in the middle of a conflict. It isn't about the soldiers. It isn't about the UN's blue flag and the blue helmets in the end. These are, brothers looking after sisters. These are one neighbor looking after a neighbor, grandfather looking after somebody else's granddaughter. It's all there in this amazing novel that the two of you have put together. Congratulations. It must have been a very difficult task, emotionally, actually, to live through all of that again. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Next time, we'll have to tell Jaipur Literary Festival to give us at least an hour and a half.
Thanks, George.
Thank you.
By my calculation, actually, we haven't done 45 minutes anyway, but they're giving me...
George, thanks so much. And we promise, if nothing else, to get you all back for another session, because I know you have so much more to ask. And this is an important story. And as George said, this is an act of heroism to try and get this story out. And the very first time, even before it was published, we had Dixie come out to Jaipur, because we knew how important it was to share this with the world, because these are stories otherwise, like many other stories of conflict, that get completely buried. with other news that tends to be top of the mind. So George Alagaya, thank you so much. Benjamin Dix, Lindsay Pollock, thank you for this wonderful
Thank you.
illustration. Thank you all for watching. We're sorry we had to cut that short and couldn't take all your questions. We thank our partners, the Aga Khan Foundation, UK, and our patron, the Mufti Family Foundation, for their support. We hope you're going to stay on with us the rest of our fabulous sessions and pose your questions, and of course join us for our closing debate and participate in the online voting. Do please consider donating to help us bridge the financial gap for JLF London at the British Library, which is free to view, and you can do so by clicking on the link below. You can also support the British Library by donating to their website. We now present a reading from the Jaipur Writer Short Series featuring writer Aruni Kashyap, followed by a reading by Eddie Matthews from the University of Swansea.
Hi, my name is Aruni Kashyap. I'm a writer from Assam, Northeast India, and I'll be reading from my short story, The Americans, from the collection His Father's Disease, that is due for publication in November 2020 by Flip Eye Books, London. It was previously published in India by Context Books, an imprint of Westland Publications, in 2019. Here is it, The Americans. The Americans. At the International Students Orientation, the staff teaches you how to say sorry and thank you. They say when someone says they're sick, you should say, I'm sorry. The students you sit next to are North Indians. They are the kind of loud and patriotic North Indians you normally wouldn't be caught dead with. You are ashamed that you are laughing with them. What other funny things these Americans are going to teach us? The handsome Punjabi boy with a beard asks you before switching to Hindi, and you like the way he pronounces Americans. Hindi is not your language, but you don't mind that he assumes you speak and understand it because you're from India. You laugh with the Punjabi guy. A few days later, you're surprised that you are drawn to the Bangladeshi students, the Bangladeshis whom you grew up slightly hating for migrating in thousands to your already overpopulated state. You talk about rice and fish curry and Durga Puja and Bhupen Hazarika's songs and feel guilty. You hang out with Shahid, the student from Dhaka, who challenges you to eat a burger without making a mess on your plate. He borrows his friend's car and drives you to Minneapolis, where both of you eat at a restaurant called The Taste of India, run by Punjabi-speaking Pakistanis. Garlic naan and butter chicken, gulab jamun for dessert. You both almost weep with joy. When you offer him money for gas, he scolds you. Don't be so money-minded like the Americans. A month later, Shubham, the Punjabi guy, and Shahid, the Bangladeshi guy, are your closest friends. When you fall sick in October, they turn up at your apartment instead of sending texts such as XOXO, get well soon, and I'm so sorry you are sick. They make you spicy soup, sleep on your couches, and make lists of girls they want to fuck. A week later, you don't tell your mother about those lists, your bad health, about the winter that is coming too soon. Instead, you tell her that there are 2 seasons in Minnesota, winter and preparing to fight through winter. She laughs. You think about how she was silent at the eye hospital when you pressed her hand. You're suddenly surprised that she understood your touch. You wonder if she cried as soon as you turned to x-ray your duffel bag at the airport. You hide in the bathroom and cry. You don't tell Shahid. You don't tell Shubham. But they both look at your reddish eyes, slap your back, and buy you a beer. They don't leave you alone because you are sad. They force their presence on you, and you like that, and you joke that the Americans would never do something like that because they are very respectful of your personal space. Mike, your roommate, has an Indian girlfriend called Nilakhi. She often spends the night in your flat, mostly during weekends. He tells you that this year has been amazing for him since he has never shared an apartment with a non-white person before, and how he's thrilled to have more international experience with an Indian girlfriend whom he started dating 3 months before you arrived. With your permission, Mike changes the apartment's Wi-Fi username to Diverse Club. You are amused and annoyed. He asks you questions that you don't like. He asks whether your hair grows straight up like the African Americans and whether you straighten your hair. He's astonished that you can speak English so well. Since he's an English major at the university, he corrects your fortnightly to every 2 weeks and your out of station to out of town, and is completely horrified when you use the word preponed. You say it is Indian English. He asks, does that even exist? He tells you about the new Pakistani student in his class who doesn't wear a skull cap and expects you to be surprised. He's surprised that you are not surprised. Mike changes the Wi-Fi username to South Asian station because he thinks it is more apt. You pretend to find it funny, but you think that he can be insufferable. In December, when his grandmother visits, she asks if you are a Muslim. She's happy to know that you aren't. She gives you a piece of lemon cake and confides in you that she worries Muslims are going to take over America soon. You nod. You don't get annoyed. But you are annoyed when everyone wishes you Merry Christmas on the last working day before Christmas. You rant about it to Shubham and Shahid. It doesn't bother them. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it.
Hi, my name is Eddie Matthews. I recently finished my PhD in creative writing at Swansea University, and I'm honored to share with you an excerpt from my novel Border Memories. The scene takes place at a cemetery in Tijuana. The sweat on my shirt cooled, hair plastered my ears. I couldn't breathe properly. When I'd inhale deeply, my chest would seize up, or I'd cough for a few seconds and spit out phlegm. In every moment it felt like there was a film over my eyes that I could not peel back, which made my depth perception slightly off, like being submerged underwater. I sensed movement and walked to where the sound was coming from and saw a figure hidden by one of the few pepper trees in the first row of graves beside the freeway. I followed the path around the tree and watched the figure take the form of an old man in a wheelchair, reaching for the headstone of the nearest grave. Leaning forward as far as he could, just far enough, so his fingertips touched the top of the wooden cross that had Maria painted across it with the birth date, 8/21/2001, and the death date peeled away except for the year, also 2001. The old man finished his prayer and looked at me as if he had been expecting me. I took the handle of his wheelchair and rolled him to the next grave in the row where I watched as he leaned forward and touched a headstone. In front of the headstone was the fenced space where sunflowers, roses, daisies, and chrysanthemums grew. The old man closed his eyes and mumbled a prayer, and all I could see were the outline of his profile, the hair of his mustache, and the movement of his lips. He finished and pointed to the next grave. This one had the birth and death as the same date. In front of the headstone was a circle of rocks the length and width of a small child, and inside the circle was a rubber dinosaur, toy car, Mickey Mouse, all bleached from the elements. The headstone was just out of reach, so I locked the brakes of the wheelchair and put a hand under his belly and another on his back so that he could lean further out of his seat to touch the cross and say whatever he needed to say. I watched his eyebrows bend with contemplative prayers as he kept going down the line. A grave like a brick pizza oven, a pink cross, a cross with cherubim, one with a wreath, one with a name faded, one with the number 38 and nothing else. Where am I? I asked. A graveyard for orphans, he replied. Thanks for listening.